because you've essentially distilled all of your learnings, the ability to break down a song to its various components. And then on top of that, you're layering a narrative-based framework. Can you tell me more about that?
Okay, so I think about music in terms of the elements of music. I've never actually defined this, so this is interesting. By looking at music with this framework, I'm able to, when I listen to my favorite artists, I think about how they are using these 6 elements of music. And what I realized is...
So Saral, you are a singer-songwriter, a composer, and a music educator. You're known for your solo project, Polarity Code, but lately you've been putting in work into a music education platform called Too Many Hooks. I think we have a lot to chat about. Thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate you, and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited to be here, and you don't get an opportunity to share about your story that often, so I'm excited for the opportunity, and thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. So let's go back to your older works. Can you tell me a little bit about Polarity Code?
Sure. So I started Polarity Code in October of 2018, and prior to that point, I was primarily a singer. I had been taking voice lessons for a while, and I had been in bands before that, and my primary role in those bands was to write the vocal melodies and the lyrics, but not so much compose the music. And so with Polarity Code, my whole goal was to learn how to write songs, compose music, which is something I had never done before. And so I started October 2018. By the end of 2018, so 3 months later roughly, I had become completely obsessed with songwriting. I started learning everything I could about the craft, took online courses, formed a team of mentors, watched many hundreds of hours of YouTube videos. And then over the course of time, I just wanted to spend more of my time on Polarity Code. And so it eventually became a bigger project than what I originally thought it was going to.
Yeah. Okay. What was that, process of songwriting and composition like for you?
When I first started, there were two different work streams that I was focused on. The first was just the technical learning of how to write songs, how to write chord progressions, melodies, craft that into a structure that ultimately becomes a song. But the second thing was also trying to experiment and find my own original style, my own original blend of genres to create something unique. And that was one of the things that I was drawn to about songwriting and Polarity Code is it gave me an opportunity as my own solo project to explore different musical ideas and not have to have somebody else's creative input into the process. And so while I was learning about the technical aspects of songwriting, I was also exploring what I wanted to write, the different styles I wanted to explore. And ultimately, I landed on rooting the music in classical music, Western classical music, but then blending in other genres like rock, pop, jazz, electronic music, and sort of doing a bunch of different mashups. And the idea was that every single EP, I wanted to focus on a different style, rooted in classical music, but by bringing in other genres.
Okay.
And so I have one EP, for example, which is classical music that has acoustic drums onto it, mixed into it. Another EP is classical music with vocals, with electronic drums and synthesized music and synthesizers. Another EP is jazz and classical music. And so it's just finding different ways to explore and push the boundaries of what classical music can be.
Okay, so it's essentially just a giant experiment with classical music at the center, but you get to, fuse a bunch of different elements, just kind of, one, develop your own voice and style, but also just kind of see the bounds of what these different genres can offer you.
That's exactly right. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to do that is primarily I like all different styles of music, and I didn't want to just limit myself to a specific style or have a specific sound that I would have to use across all these different EPs.
Yeah.
The other thing is, because this was a solo project that was focused on just experimentation, I wasn't focused on working on one album at a time. Mm-hmm. I was more focused on, in this song, I want to do this, explore this idea. In another song, I wanted to explore another idea. And so I wasn't writing music from an album perspective, if that makes sense. And it just gave me the opportunity to explore different styles across songs. And then those styles eventually morphed into, all right, I'm going to do 5 songs within this style, call that an EP,
Okay.
and move on to another EP of a different style.
Okay.
And currently I have a list of all the different types of mashups that I want to experiment with
Yeah.
over the course of the coming years. And so it just gives me a way to continuously push the boundaries, learn about different genres of music, and create music that doesn't limit me to what I'm able to do.
Yeah.
The nice thing is that I use mostly a DAW to produce music.
Okay.
And so I don't have the limitations of just playing an instrument and having to write music with that instrument and not being able to explore outside of that. With DAW-based production, you can bring in different bring in different samples, bring in different sounds, and it doesn't require an additional amount of overhead to do that.
So for those listening, what is a DAW, a DAW?
A DAW, a digital audio workstation, is what it stands for. And essentially, it's a way for you to, I've never actually defined this, so this is interesting. It essentially is a way for you to bring in different parts of music. So like if you're in a rock band, you can record a guitar part, you can record a bass line, record drum parts, and then vocals, and all of that will be maintained within a file, a DAW file. I use Logic Pro, so within a Logic Pro file, that allows you to then go in and produce the track, produce the song, basically blend all the different elements, add the automation, add the effects in order to ultimately export the song from Logic Pro.
Okay, cool. As you're going through the Polarity Code experiment and trying a bunch of different stuff, what did you learn about your style and what your likes were? That's, I imagine it's different in the beginning versus the end.
Yeah, so I'm going to take a step back before I answer your question directly. One of the things that I started to learn about through some of my mentors is what the elements of music are. And so you can go online and search for the elements of music, and you'll see some frameworks have 6 elements of music, some have 7, some have 10. In my own view, I break it down into 6 elements of music, which are melody, harmony, rhythm, instrument, texture, and dynamics. And so I think about music in terms of the elements of music. When I listen to other music, my favorite artists, I think about how they are using these 6 elements of music to craft songs. And what I realized is by looking at music with this framework, I'm able to apply it to different genres of music. All types of music, all music ever created can be broken down using these 6 elements of music. So once I started to think about music in this way, I would listen to my favorite songs, my favorite artists, and sort of analyze and dissect how they used these elements of music. And from that, I started to figure out not only which artists I like, but the reasons I like them. And then from there, I was able to take these ideas, use them in my music, embellish on them, and then mix it and combine them to create my own original style. And that's the process by which I created the style that I currently have, is just by experimenting not with different sounds, but by experimenting with how I want to use the 6 elements of music for my own creativity. For example, for me, I love rhythm. Like drum programming is one of my favorite things to do. I like experimenting with different time signatures. And so for me, the element of rhythm is very prominent in my music. Because I don't have a great background as an instrumentalist, like piano. I have played some piano and some guitar in the past, but I'm not great at those instruments. Okay. So for me, I tend to have music that has simpler harmonies. I'm slowly moving into more complex use of harmonic functions and chord progressions. But for now, the main elements that I use are melody, rhythm, and then I love dynamics as well, which is a direct inspiration from classical music, where you have crescendos and decrescendos and quiet sections. Yeah. And so I basically just am constantly experimenting with how do I want to use the elements of music in my songs, and then developing how I use those elements of music to continually evolve as a songwriter.
When you think about the elements of music, how do you balance that with it just sounds good? Because, a lot of like the punk bands from the 80s, it's just a 4-piece band in a garage just smashing things together. And they're like, yeah, it sounds good. We don't know why. We can't read music, barely know chord progressions, but I like how this sounds, versus the technical ability and the music analysis and the theory behind it. What do you think is the balance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I almost, because my focus when I first started Polarity Code was to learn how to write music, I had this mindset, this mentality where I viewed a song not as the end goal, but I viewed a song as a mechanism by which I can learn about composition.
Okay.
And so that paradigm has continued going forward, where now I think about a song as a way for me to experiment with new musical ideas and learn about different techniques that I otherwise would not have explored in as much depth if I didn't have this paradigm. And so I'm constantly finding myself having to balance between learning new techniques and then also just writing a song because I like the way it sounds. And I think over time I found that these two are not separate entities, right? The process of learning how to implement a new technique in my music results in a music that's different and unique for me, and therefore I'm able to analyze it just as a creator and find different ways of incorporating these techniques to create sounds that I like and to create songs that I like.
Okay.
Not just, I'm going to do this because I want to learn about this, but now how can I use this to create a song that I personally enjoy listening to?
Okay, gotcha. If you were to talk to yourself and give yourself advice to, Saral from years prior, what would you tell them to kind of make that, discovery of your style and your skill and your craft just a little bit easier?
And you're talking about just to clarify, when I started Polarity Code or
I would say, let's pick 2 points in time. When
Okay.
you were first learning like music, craft, and theory and production, and then when you first started the solo project.
Okay. I think when I first started getting into music earlier in my life, the thing I will tell myself is just to constantly explore. I think back then I knew the type of music that I liked, and I was just so focused on recreating that type of music and using that as a heavy inspiration for what I was doing at the time, especially as a vocalist. I would listen to my favorite singers and just emulate what they were doing. The problem with that is my favorite singers were, at the time, mostly rock and rollers, and my voice naturally isn't conducive to screaming and belting, and so I have a different style that wasn't conducive to emulating what my favorite singers were doing. And so for me, one of the things I'd go back and tell myself earlier on is find my own style, experiment more, and don't try to emulate as much. Since I started Polarity Code, the thing that I still struggle with, but have become better over time, but definitely when I first started is something I struggled with, is finding the balance between the science and the art of it, the creative side and the technical side. My personal background, my training, my education is more on the engineering side.
Yep.
And so I started to think about music when I first started Polarity Code in a very technical way. And over time, I found myself shifting from the left brain to the right brain gradually. It's still a constant balance that I struggle with, but I think now at a point, because of some of the processes and the workflows that I've developed, I'm able to balance that a little bit more intentionally than I did when I first started.
Okay, that makes sense. So what I'm hearing from this lays, from what I'm hearing for Polarity Code, lays the perfect foundation for your newest effort, Too Many Hooks, because you've essentially distilled all of your learnings, the ability to break down a song to its various components. You mentioned 6. And then on top of that, you're layering a narrative-based framework. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, exactly. And you want me to go into some details? Okay.
Yeah, please.
So when I first started Polarity Code and was in the process of learning all these different techniques and songwriting in general, I found myself running into the same issues that every songwriter runs into. Examples are, how do you write a second verse? How do you come up with a hook for the chorus? How do I create a collection of songs that aren't all doing the same thing and that are diverse? How do I continue to write diverse songs over time? How do I structure a song that's interesting and not just fall into the traditional intro, verse, chorus sort of cycle and structure? So all of these how do I start a song and make sure that I actually finish it versus having a bunch of song parts? All of these common problems and issues that every songwriter runs into. I was dealing with those as well. And my solution to try to overcome these issues was just to go online, do YouTube searches on strategies to overcome these issues, take online courses on specific topics, but none of that was really helping. And so I went into this probably 2-year period of just philosophizing, coming up with different strategies so that I can overcome these roadblocks. And I was watching, I don't remember the movie I was watching. I wish I did, but I was watching a movie and I remember getting to the end credits and you see, hundreds of different people working on a movie, and it's all the different elements that go into movie making, like production, cinematography, lighting, design, costume, script writing, all the different functions. And I remember asking myself, what is it that each of these different departments and functions are using to make decisions that help this movie have a cohesion to it across all the different elements? And after I thought about this for a while, it's like, oh, it's the story, right? The story is helping everybody make decisions that ultimately lead to a movie which tells a story which is cohesive. And it sounds quite simple, but this was an aha moment for me in the sense of I took this idea and then I applied it to songwriting. And I was like, okay, those are the elements of movie making. What are the elements of songwriting? And that's how I came up with those 6 that I mentioned earlier. The next thing was, how do I conceptualize a song as a story, right? If earlier I mentioned that the thing that the thread that's making all movies have this cohesion to it is the story, how do I apply that to songwriting? And basically I started to think about songs not necessarily as an intro, a verse, a pre-chorus, a chorus, verse 2, chorus 2, bridge, outro.
Yeah.
But I saw each of these sections almost like a scene that's developing the plot, which goes from the intro to the outro. And then all those 6 different elements that I mentioned earlier are almost like characters that are going through the different scenes. When I started to apply this paradigm to try to overcome those issues that I mentioned earlier, I was able to look at those problems with a new lens, this narrative lens, which then allowed me to come up with different solutions which were not traditional solutions that the songwriting educators were teaching. I spent a couple of years, maybe a year or two, just thinking about all these different problems that I was dealing with in a new way with this narrative-based approach. And literally everything had an answer suddenly. Like this one shift in my mind allowed me to come up with solutions that really started to work. Then what I did is I went online onto different Facebook groups and music groups, on Reddit, I believe, as well. And I would just start asking songwriters, what are the main challenges that they face in writing songs? And I would get hundreds of responses, and I would take these responses, put them in a spreadsheet, and then think, okay, if I was to apply a narrative-based paradigm to answer these questions, am I able to do so? And literally for every single row, for every single issue that I was told about, there was a solution using this narrative-based approach that I was able to offer. And it was only after going through this process of applying the narrative-based approach to my own songwriting, seeing that it can actually help other songwriters as well, that I finally launched Too Many Hooks. I was like, I have to teach this approach. It feels like there's fresh new solutions that it offers that songwriters can benefit from. And so that's what led me to launch Too Many Hooks about 6 months ago, October of 2023.
No, that feels good. I think having that perspective change and like a unifying theory or a unifying lens to really make decisions easier. Does this help me achieve X? Yes, cool, I'll keep it. No, gone. And it really makes the whole process a lot simpler.
Yeah, exactly. And just to add one more piece to this, earlier in my life, I spent 2 years studying towards a doctoral degree. I never finished the degree, but one of the things I learned through that 2 year period, in that 2 year period, is that sometimes the best research or the greatest ideas come when you borrow theories and concepts from other domains. And so as I was looking for solutions for my own songwriting, I had this idea in mind that if I look for solutions within what's being offered within the songwriting pedagogy, then I'm not going to come up with something unique that's going to solve my problems in an innovative way. And that's when I started looking for concepts and techniques outside of songwriting. And then the movie and the narrative-based approach is where I ultimately landed on. And so yeah, that's been, I think, the thing that has pushed me through is borrowing these concepts from fields outside of just traditional songwriting methods.
Okay. Have you had any students so far go through your program?
I have. I've had, but I did when I first launched Too Many Hooks, I did a workshop where I taught students a full day session teaching them this approach. And then since then, I've developed about a 2-month songwriting program that leads someone from the basic components that go into this narrative-based approach to then actually using it for some songwriting at the end of the program. And I've had about a handful of students now. It's been very, very well received. I've gotten better feedback than I ever thought I would. And so I'm just continuing to try to take on more students. I have a YouTube channel as well where I'm teaching these approaches through the videos that someone can consume on their own time. And yeah, so overall, it's been very well received so far, which I'm glad because it's helped me so much. And just to get that validation that there is something here that is more universal than just applying something for my own mentality and from the way that I work has been very reassuring.
Okay. What are some of the things that people can expect to learn by going through that course and looking at your stuff? Just a little bit of depth because I want people to still, go check out your stuff and view the things, but enough to where people can get an idea.
I think the thing that it goes back to what I said earlier, which is when I went online and asked people for what issues they're having, and I was able to help solve those issues using this approach for any issue that they were having, is what I think I bring to the table here, as well as what this narrative-based approach brings to the table, in the sense of it can help with the songwriting, it can help with the psychology of like finishing songs, it can help with once you finish a song, how do you overcome the hurdles of actually releasing it and getting, criticism from the world if they don't like your song or if they think you should take your song in a different direction. So I think the general answer is it provides a framework for any sort of problem that you might have within the songwriting process and anything related to that.
I think it's really smart how you crowdsource the problems from the exact community that you're trying to solve, especially because the problems that they're presenting, they're pretty evergreen. Like, techniques and new technologies may change. They may, swap out instruments and blah, blah, blahs. But the core problems that they're running into are the same problems that, singer-songwriters have been dealing with for, hundreds of years, if not more.
Yeah, and what's been interesting for me is in this process, I didn't mention earlier, but I also was researching what's being taught at universities, being taught at these more formal institutions, and really music education hasn't changed much, like you said, in hundreds of years. Right? We're still here in the U.S. We're still using the Western philosophies that like come from classical music and the role of harmony and just like teaching all these methods, and there hasn't been much disruption in music education, despite the fact that there has been a ton of disruption with music technology, right? So music technology is sort of growing at an exponential rate, and music education is stagnated.
Yeah.
And so I think it was with that lens, and I was like, there's got to be a way to innovate within the education space to allow the technology to like be a conduit for greater music.
What are some of the fun new technologies that you've been experiencing with and playing around with?
So it's interesting for me. So if I take a step back, I enjoy the composition more than the production.
Okay.
And so a lot of the technologies that have come out are, this may not be entirely true, but like with the advent of DAW, with like auto-tune, with AI, all of these different technologies, a lot of it is maybe more focused on the production side and perhaps not as much on the composition side. I probably still need to think about what I just said in a little bit more detail, but that's what it feels like to me.
Okay.
And for me personally, I've always had more of an affinity for composition than production. I love writing notes that don't exist. I don't like producing as much. I leave the sound design and those sorts of things more to my producer who I work with. And I just like writing the notes. I like writing the parts. And so within that context though, I mean, when I was growing up, the DAW did not exist. Like Logic Pro was not an option. And that really, without that, I don't know how I would have gotten into songwriting with the same level of depth that I've been able to. So for me, I love the fact that we now can write music on our laptops. And I think from there, I have samples, of course. I do a lot of string orchestration in my music, and it would be way too expensive to hire. I do have a quartet that records parts for me, but just to have a way to workshop different ideas, have string samples that allow me to hear what a specific orchestration I'm working on will sound like has been just critical for my process.
I mean, I think technology has really democratized, everyone's access and ability to kind of create these things. Because, to date myself, I was born in 93. Music when I was, a wee child was on CDs, right? My parents, it was vinyl. But if I wanted to hear a new piece of music, like there was a bit of effort, like streaming services didn't exist. The internet was barely a thing when I was young. It was just coming online. So it was really hard to find and listen things, to, understand a music style, to, be exposed to new instruments or compositions or tones and stuff like that. And it was hard to find that, let alone understand how they actually did it. It's not like you can just go check on someone's YouTube channel and be like, hey, how'd you make this guitar tone? And I just feel like technology has allowed people to kind of reach and grasp things that was otherwise out of reach.
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. What is it? I think 75,000 new songs are released every day on Spotify. So I forget, the number changes. I remember last year, I believe it was like 60,000 and like the number just keeps growing exponentially. I mean, people all over the world have access to these tools now, which is great, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say I'm blessed for the fact that these tools exist, or else I wouldn't be talking to you here today if it wasn't for that.
Speaking of, music distribution, things were very different back then. You had to have a label. You had to get studio time. You had to record in, all of these places that are prohibitively expensive. And you also had to have clout and know people. But nowadays, you just sit in your bedroom, smash a couple things together on a DAW, I don't know, GarageBand or Logic, throw it up on SoundCloud or Spotify, and now you have the potential to reach practically unlimited number of people. It's crazy.
It is. I mean, I think Billie Eilish was discovered that way. When she was, early teens, where she just released music on SoundCloud, and that's how she grew her fan base and became popular. So I mean, it's fantastic. Of course, there are drawbacks to that. You lose, I think, some people have referred to it as the monoculture, whereas like earlier on, before there was the advent of all this technology, everyone knew the new releases that artists were releasing, the new songs that artists were releasing. Everyone sort of knew the same songs, and so it created this culture where you had this common set of music, this common collection of artists that everyone was talking about, and it just made it feel a little bit more communal in a way. Now there's this more dispersion. Everyone is focused on their own niche, and there isn't that same monoculture. So there's drawbacks to that. There's also, of course, positives to that, which is you're able to explore new music, find new music, and it all depends.
I think, the world has just gotten more complicated. Like, back then there was like, there's rock, there's pop, there's disco, there's funk. And now you have like 35 different flavors of rock, and each of that have subcategories. And there's infinite depth depending on how far you want to go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, no. I mean, exactly. The biggest challenge is, how do you find these artists? Right.
Yeah.
This is something that I struggle with, and still have to do a better job of finding this new music. It's out there, and there's some incredible artists. But the challenge now is we're so we consume based on algorithms.
Yeah.
And so if you want to go and explore outside of that algorithm, how do you do it? And that's something that I'm still struggling with. I've gotten better at it. I have some sources that I go to learn about new music that I otherwise would not have known about.
Yeah.
But still, algorithms have changed the way that we consume music for sure.
I mean, I feel like this is purely anecdotal. I have no evidence to back any of this up. But I feel like the algorithms were a little more generous 5 to 7 years ago. Like, I can actually discover new music in that fashion. Whereas lately, I don't know, to date this podcast, we'll say mid 2024. I feel like it just kind of plays the same old things, like, I don't know, the same 30 things that I've listened to on shuffle. So as a result, I've just actually reached out to like my in-person community, people that I know or have interacted with, and be like, hey, what new things are you listening to? And, you know, someone's like, oh man, there's this cool new punk band coming out of like the south of Paris, very specific to this very niche neighborhood. I'm like, how the hell did you ever find that? But they did. And then they shared it. And that's how I get exposed to new music.
Yeah, no, I do something very similar. And you're right. I think, I don't know if I've thought about it too much, but it does feel like algorithms are finer now in their recommendations. Whereas before there might have been a little bit more sort of, we think this is what you might like, but it's not based so much on data.
Yeah.
Right. It's just based on trying to feed you music and seeing what your reaction is, sort of, and then do the data-based analysis from there.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's something that I haven't thought a whole lot about, but it is true. I go onto Spotify and I kind of know what they're going to recommend to me these days.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So taking a step back, let's say someone is trying to get into music and they have no background. That's, I don't know, I'm a 12-year-old and I don't know an instrument. I know nothing about composition, and I've occasionally listened to the radio or various things on Spotify. What's your recommendation for someone trying to move into the space? Is it learn an instrument first? Is it, you know, just like songs or analyze songs that you listen on the radio and see what it comes out to be? What do you think?
No, I think it's a combination of what you said, and I think for me, in any domain, anything you want to do in life, the first thing is to make sure that you're going to enjoy doing it.
Yeah.
Right. So if someone, and you may not know until you get into actually starting to write songs, but just to first really ask yourself, is this something that you can see yourself spending time doing? Music specifically and songwriting, there's a steep learning curve.
Yeah.
It's just as a random side note tangent. I was watching Shark Tank the other day, and there was a story of somebody who didn't know anything about business and just wanted to launch a product because it was a cool thing to do.
Yeah.
And within a year or so, they had a product launch. They were making a bunch of money and thinking about turning it into a full-time career at that point.
Yeah.
And with music, there's just such a steep learning curve to get to a point that you're writing songs that you like. And so the first thing is just to make sure that you're willing to go down that path and be dedicated to it. So all that said, assuming that that is in place and that you are interested in writing songs, I think it's a combination of what you said, which is listen to as much music as possible, not only as a consumer of music, but as someone who's as with the role of identifying what is it that you like about different types of music, and what using that as an input to determining what kind of music that you want to write.
Yeah.
Once you figure that out, then you can go, if that music is rock and roll, for example, then playing guitar seems like a next natural step, or a natural step to take along with that. And so I think it's figuring out what type of music you want to write, and then starting to collect the tools and the skills to make that kind of music. Of course, over time, you'll probably pivot like all artists do, but I think just getting down that path of matching the music you want to write with the skills to do it is what I would recommend.
I think you hit the nail on the head about pursuing things that you're interested in and that you're going to enjoy doing. So for context, like I never had formal music lessons growing up outside of like the band program that I was part of in public school. And neither did my siblings. And yet to this day, we self-taught ourselves instruments, guitar, piano, singing, drums, whatever. And we still practice it to this day. Whereas my cousins, they got signed up for piano lessons and violin lessons. There was that pressure on them like, hey, every week you got to practice, and then you're going to have a lesson with the teacher, and then they're going to grill you on stuff, and they don't touch music at all anymore. So it's very interesting, like the environment and the, I guess, agency to choose, I want to pursue this because it's interesting versus being forced to.
Yeah. If I can share a story kind of related to that, going earlier to the roots of my music interest. So I played the flute in middle school, the guitar in high school, and then for a short while, somewhere in between, I played piano for a little while.
Yeah.
And I had this issue with my hands specifically, that after playing any of these instruments for 30 to 45 minutes, my hands would start to sweat so bad that I literally couldn't play the instrument anymore. I remember once I was performing guitar, and I wasn't nervous or anything, but I had been practicing before the performance, and by the time I got to the performance, my hands were so sweaty that I dropped the guitar.
Oh no.
It was so embarrassing. But I think just for me, after high school, I went into college and I was thinking, I want to continue music because I love it, but I can't play anything that requires my hands. And so that's when I started learning how to sing.
Yeah.
My first voice teacher, as a freshman in college, we did our first lesson, and at the end of the lesson, he said, "You're the worst singer that I've ever heard." And I had paid for one semester's worth of lessons, and so he basically said, I'll give you a refund. There's no point in continuing.
Oof, yeah.
And I didn't tell him this story, but I basically just said, well, in my mind, I don't have any other option because I have this issue with my hands. And so I just continued taking lessons. Long story short, that turned into 10 or so years of taking lessons. All of it was for fun. I would basically just practice in my place, in my bathroom, where there's good acoustics. And I was never in a band. I didn't perform. It was literally just, I wanted to learn how to sing. I wanted music to be a part of my life. And then only later on did I get into the songwriting aspect of it. I was like, oh, now I can maybe turn this into something. But the root of it was, I just loved music and I wanted it to be a part of my life. Whether I was performing or releasing music or not, I just had to do something musically. Yeah. And I think that is what sustained me over the years.
I think understanding the love of it is what drives you, and not your technical ability or your, how good you are. Because I know, at least because information is so accessible nowadays, it's very easy to be like, I want to learn guitar. And then you go on YouTube, and then all of a sudden you discover this 6-year-old who's just destroying it on guitar, despite the fact that they're 6, they've been playing it for 3 years, stuff like that. And then you just get discouraged. But if you focus on the enjoyment of the activity and you just kind of ignore other people's opinions and you ignore comparison, then you can go quite far.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I had the exact same experience because as I was taking lessons, I started to learn opera, and I would go online and I'd watch these 5-year-old kids belting out opera, and it's wait, what is happening here? Why am I doing this? But yeah, as soon as I start comparing myself to all these incredible musicians in the world, it would become intimidating and I would lose motivation. So I try to ground myself and ask myself why I do this. It's just the love of music.
So I think there's a very fine line of comparison between where it's beneficial and where it's harmful. So we just talked about the harmful side of it. But there's a little verbal excerpt by a person named Ira Glass called The Gap that I love and adore.
I've heard of this, yep.
Yeah, so for those listening, The Gap, essentially go listen to it if you have the chance, but the excerpt is there's this gap between your current ability and what you can actually execute on. And you already have the taste developed to where you say, I like this is good, I don't like that, that's bad. but you don't have the ability to do it well. Like, I've been playing guitar for, I don't know, 16, 17 years at this point, and I've kind of accepted that even with diligent practice, I'm not going to be John Mayer, right? But I can look at a song like Neon, where he's just doing disgusting things with his hands, just ungodly level of talent. And I try to do the thing and I come nowhere close. But, I can recognize that and I can work towards it and strive towards it. And just the diligent practice gets me there. Have you kind of experienced that in your own works to where you're like, I see this person, they are a god at their craft, I want to get there, but I'm here. I just need to work a little bit harder to kind of pursue that path. Even if I never get there, I'm closer.
Absolutely. So it goes back to a couple of things I mentioned earlier, which is the learning curve required to be an artist, specifically as a musician. It's just it's significant, right? So in order to stay consistent with it, having a goal in mind is very helpful.
Yeah.
What I had done when I was singing is I had a wall in my place that I covered with posters of my favorite singers. In some cases, I just had like their name written on the wall. And so I just had like 50 to 60 of my favorite singers on this wall. And I just always ask myself, like, am I getting closer in some capacity to these singers' abilities?
Yeah.
Now, some of these were my favorite singers who I don't think I'd ever be as good as. But just making sure that I'm continuously making progress towards getting to that point that my favorite singers did is what drove me, right, at the time, is that I was not only did I enjoy singing, but I had a specific goal in mind as to what I wanted to become as a singer. And I think having that sort of North Star, that compass, helps you focus on the things that matter, because you can easily get distracted with many different things as a musician.
Yeah.
Right. And so for me, it was, okay, I want to get to this point just as a personal goal, and I'm willing to put in the time, put in the effort, knowing that it's going to take a while. But having that sort of goal helped me stay focused.
So going back to something you mentioned earlier in the conversation, and speaking of idols and people that you appreciate, so I've been singing for about 15, 16 years now, and a lot of the bands that I like to listen to are like A Day to Remember or Sleeping with Sirens, very post pop punk, like 2008 era, but I just can't get screaming down. So like, I love listening to this thing. I hate actually doing the thing. So there's this divergence between what I enjoy listening to versus what I actually enjoy doing. Can you tell me a little bit more about your experience there?
I have a lot to share about that. Yeah, so we'll get into some details. Some of my favorites. So I grew up in my youth just obsessed with rock and roll.
Yeah.
So I liked all kinds of rock, whether it was alternative, grunge, metal, punk. And so some of my favorite singers were, we live in Seattle. I was obsessed with Lane Staley before moving here, which is one of the reasons I moved here. Lane Staley from Alice in Chains, Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden was huge influence on me. And I also did not have that ability to scream. There's actually a famous quote from Tom York from Radiohead, who just despises his voice because he says it sounds too pretty and too smooth, I think is the word he used. And he wanted to have a little bit more grit in his voice.
Yeah.
And I am in this exact same situation where as soon as I start to add grit, my mechanism, like my instrument, doesn't really facilitate that type of vocalization.
Yeah.
And so earlier in my life, I wanted to be a rock and roll singer, like all of my favorite singers, and I physically was not able to sing in that style. And that's actually when I started to deviate and explore my own style, which is what I mentioned earlier with the recommendation for anyone new, is to like eventually find that path that's your own, given where you are and what you like and what you're able and what you're capable of doing. And so for me, I spent a long period of time trying to explore different music that fit my style, what I was able to do vocally, yet also was interesting to me, given that rock was not a great option for my voice.
Right.
And eventually I landed on like the mashups that we talked about earlier. And the nice thing about the mashups and the nice thing about having classical music as sort of the foundation with other genres blended in, is that I have operatic training, and you can use that for many different styles of music outside of just classical. And so that's how I came up with that style, is a combination of music I liked while also thinking about what my voice was capable of doing and then putting that together.
So taking those learnings and bringing it back to your solo project, Polarity Code, where do you want to take that? What do you want to do and explore?
I have two versions of that, two answers. The first is I just want to continue to get into this mindset of exploring new ways to blend classical music with other genres. I have so many different concepts in my mind. The challenge with this approach is that because every single EP, which is a different style, requires me to learn a whole new set of techniques, and I'm not doing the same thing from EP to EP, it just takes longer. And so I just have to make sure that I maintain this learning mindset, this sort of pushing myself to explore new boundaries. And the second piece is eventually I definitely want to start performing and touring. That is my goal. I don't do a lot of digital marketing. I'm not promoting my music much at all on Instagram or on any social media platform. For me, I write my music and I do that with the intention of eventually performing it. So when I'm writing songs, I actually think a lot about what will these songs sound like in a live setting, and how can I incorporate different parts within the songs that are different than what I've done in other songs, so that in a live setting, the patron will get a different experience across the different types of songs. And so I'm constantly thinking about how to diversify songs for a live situation, and then pushing myself to explore new territory.
So back on the first point that you mentioned about blending classical with various styles, what's been the most interesting mashup that you've come across so far? And then I'll say my own after.
In my own music?
Yes.
Okay, so in classical music, there is a technique, something called an ostinato. An ostinato, you can almost think of it like a riff in rock music.
Okay.
But essentially, it's a repeating rhythmic pattern that is used to add more of a rhythmic profile to the music.
Like a motif, right?
A motif. And the reason for ostinatos in classical music is because the drums don't play as much of a role in creating groove. In classical music, drums are more used for accents, whereas like in rock and pop, drums are used for the groove. Yeah. And so one of the things, because I have an interest in rock and therefore in like groove and energy, is how can I apply this idea from rock into classical music? So one of the things I've done is intentionally remove the use of ostinatos in my music, so don't have like string lines that keep playing a repeating pattern, and create enough space rhythmically for drums. By doing that, I'm now able to blend rock and roll or any like electronic drums into my music, and still have string parts, because those string parts are not playing as rhythmically intense ostinatos. And so that's one example of how I've been able to blend and sort of modernize classical music, if you will.
Okay, that's really cool. I love that take. The example that I was going to give is, I'm pretty sure that metal music is just classical music with distortion, right? I mean, obviously there's various here.
Keep going. Yeah.
But there's a lot of like Beethoven's Fifth. Someone did an excellent metal cover on it, and it sounds so good, and yet it still holds true to what I think Beethoven intended with the song. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, my mixing engineer says the exact same thing, which is that modern day classical music is metal, basically, because of like all the different interesting rhythms that are happening, blending it with different like harmonic use of harmony and dissonance. And so, yeah, he says the exact same thing, which is, if you want to hear modern classical music, start with heavy metal.
And then to swing back to your other project, Too Many Hooks, what are your plans for the future? What do you want to do and explore and, create, push out into the world?
Yeah, so I think because this is a fairly unique approach to songwriting, one of the things I want to do is expose as many people around the world to this idea. Of course, not everyone will resonate with it, but I just want to share it with as many people as I can. And so a couple of things I'm doing to meet this goal is I have a YouTube channel, which of course you are helping me with, which I greatly appreciate.
Of course, happy to help.
And so eventually I just want to, not eventually, I want to continue releasing videos on the YouTube channel for Too Many Hooks and use that as a way to introduce people into the platform so that they can learn more. I'm not sure yet, of course, there's a limit to how many people I can teach at one time, but I definitely want to take on more students, probably release it as an online course that's self-consumable, maybe start a community of songwriters using this approach. So there's many different ways that I can see myself expanding it, but the general goal is just to expand the reach as far as I can.
I mean, I think, having more information, high quality information out in the world is a good thing because people can be exposed to it. They can say, yes, this is for me. No, it's for not. They have the agency to decide what's best for them, but at least they're aware of the tools that exist, and that's really nice.
Yeah, exactly. And like anything, you can apply whatever parts of the program, whatever parts of the narrative-based songwriting resonate with you for whatever you're doing, right? So I have a pretty comprehensive set of tools and frameworks that you can use, but it's pick and choose, right? So whatever works for someone, they can apply it for their own situation, just like anything else.
Yeah.
And so that's what I like, is that I'm not saying that you have to use this in as stringent of a way as I might personally be using it, but just take whatever resonates with you and apply it for your own style, for your own workflows, etc.
Yeah, it's a toolbox. You get to take and decide what you need. You don't have to use every tool all the time.
Exactly.
So a closing tradition that we have on the show is the previous guest leaves a question for the current guest, not knowing who the current guest might be.
Okay.
And the question that's left for you is, what is the first thing that you've created that you felt proud of?
Okay, let me think about this. The first thing I've created that I felt proud of, I think it would be before I started Polarity Code. I was starting to explore different styles of music that I wanted to dive deeper into in Polarity Code.
Yeah.
But because I wasn't a songwriter at the time, Polarity Code is when I learned how to write songs, I went online and I would find, I forget the names of the sites, but there were a couple of sites where you can download tracks that other people have created. And in my case, I would download these tracks and just write vocals and sing vocals on top of them. And I remember thinking some of these tracks were really cool. Like it allowed me to explore with avant-garde vocal techniques, like weird vocalizations. And I remember thinking that was sort of the seeds of creativity were planted with these initial songs that I created by taking online musical tracks and then applying my own vocals to them. And that gave me the confidence to start Polarity Code, thinking, okay, I feel like I have the ability creatively to explore and find my own style, because I went through this process a year or two before I started Polarity Code in experimenting with different vocal styles specifically. And so I think those were some of the first things that I was creatively really proud of, which gave me the confidence to then start Polarity Code.
It's always fun listening to people's, origin stories, for lack of a better word, just to really see where they came from, because we all start from the same place of not knowing anything or how to do anything, and with almost no skills. But then, it's the diligent effort, like we talked about earlier, the persistent practice to layer the foundational skills down so you have that, and then build and build and build to where you are today.
Yeah. I think if I think about some of my friends who I think have the potential to be fantastic musicians and songwriters, but haven't been able to get to that point. One of the themes I see across this population of people is just a lack of self-belief. And so one of the things that I've sort of learned about myself over time is that I've always had a strong belief in myself. It probably came from like small victories that I don't even remember from earlier in my life that have slowly built up over time.
Yeah.
Where now I'm at a point where if I don't have a specific skill set or a deficit in a specific area, I know that I can learn the skills required to accomplish that. YouTube videos, right? With your help as an example, I knew nothing about videography, and then just over the course of 1 or 2 years, just learned the different techniques, learned about editing, learned about how to make a video interesting, and then you build from there. And I think it's the same thing with anything that you learn, creative or not, artistic or not, is just having that self-belief to push through and knowing that eventually you will get to that point, overcome that gap, as you mentioned with the hourglass example.
The persistence and consistency are so powerful. I can't remember who said this quote, but consistency does not guarantee success, but being inconsistent almost always guarantees failure. So,
yeah. Love that. Consistency is key for sure.
It really is.
And the way to be consistent is by doing what you love, to bring this full circle.
I love it. So before we break and end the episode, where can people find you, and where would you like to draw people's attention to?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for asking. For me, polaritycode.com is where you can learn more about my artist project. TooManyHooks.com is where you can learn more about the songwriting education. And then from the TooManyHooks.com, you'll see links to my YouTube channel where you can watch more about my videos. But the thing that I want to mention is that on the Polarity Code side, because I don't do a lot of social media marketing, the best way to keep in touch with me is by subscribing to my email list. And you'll see a form for that email list at the top of my Polarity Code website. So if you're interested in following along, please do so there.
Yeah, that sounds great. Saral, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned so much from you over the past couple of years, and also this episode today. I've known most of these things just because we're friends, we've talked about it, but it's nice to get that just one level deeper.
No, I appreciate it. This has been fantastic, and I thank you for your time. Thank you for inviting me on.
All right, absolutely. Well, cheers.